Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. Are our employers a threat to our freedom? And how should power be managed and handled and constrained within large corporations? My guest today to discuss this and more with us is Professor Elizabeth Anderson. Professor Anderson, as many of you will know, is someone whose work I've referenced on the podcast before, so it was a real pleasure to have her on, particularly in the context of my Machiavelli series, when I talked about different conceptions of freedom and how our freedom might be constrained by many factors beyond simply our government. Professor Anderson is at the University of Michigan, where she is the John Dewey Distinguished Professor and the John Rawls Collegiate Professor. She specialises in ethics, social and political philosophy, feminist theory, social epistemology, and the philosophy of economics and social sciences. She's particularly interested in exploring the interactions of social science with moral and political theory, how we learn to improve our value judgments, the epistemic functions of emotions and democratic deliberation, and issues of race, gender, and equality. She's the author of Value in Ethics and Economics, The Imperative of Integration, and most recently Private Government, How Employers Rule Our Lives and Why We Don't Talk About It. This is going to be a two-part conversation. There's a danger, I think, in having on guests who I agree with a little bit too much. So in the first part, this episode, we're going to cover the argument of private government and have a look at some of its applications. I should quickly mention, I guess, that in this episode, I reference, albeit rather obliquely, some of my personal experiences in my career. I should say that when I'm talking about working in campaigns and being a senior manager, that's stuff I used to do. I have a relatively more normal job now, but I've done a few different interesting, shall we say, things in my life in temporary and high-pressure environments in politics. So in the first part, we cover that, the argument of private government, how employers rule our lives, as Professor Anderson puts it. And then the second part is a somewhat more unstructured conversation where we really just get into it looking at the profit motive and what it's doing to our ideology and our society. And I bring in some more of my own views as well. So that's what's coming up. As always, if you do like the podcast, please share the episodes on your own social media to help get the word out there. And if you can support us in a more monetary way, please sponsor us on Patreon, patreon.com/political philosophy podcast. And if you want to like, subscribe, whatever, all the links to all of the different ways you can do that are on our website, politicalphilosophypodcast.com. Apart from that, it is my absolute pleasure to bring you the first part of my conversation with Professor Elizabeth Anderson. So, I am joined today by Elizabeth Anderson. Professor, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be talking to you.
So, I'll have already introduced you at this point, and actually I think probably a lot of the audience who listen to philosophy podcasts will be familiar with you, but for those who aren't, how do you describe what you do and the types of issues you think and write about?
Well, I do mainly work in moral and political philosophy, feminist theory, philosophy of the social sciences, and social epistemology, and I look at the interactions between these things. The chief characteristic of my work is engagement with empirical findings in history and the social sciences. I think it's key to be doing political philosophy starting from problems and problematic experiences that people are actually having on the ground, and then theorizing normatively about what's the nature of those problems, what are the best ways to understand those problems, and understanding norms as experimental. Well, you try them out. That's how you test any kind of normative proposal. You try it out and see whether the outcomes are acceptable, whether they solve the problem that was originally diagnosed, or whether they pop up new problems that then you have to contend with. So it's a pragmatist approach, which is also very deeply in common with feminist approaches to ethics and political philosophy. And that's really why I think it's really important to look at conditions on the ground and also where we came from historically, because a lot of what happens today is simply a reflection of habits we've inherited from the past, perhaps that were shaped under radically different contexts that don't really fit our current predicament.
So, listeners obviously won't be able to see this, but I often just scribble little notes as people are speaking, and I scribbled a note of experiences on the ground, because I'm going to definitely come back and reference that again. To start with, though, I've just read your work, Private Government, which I really, really like this. This was originally lectures, right? It was the Tanner lectures, and then it became a book afterwards.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And it matches something. So here's why I wanted to talk to you, is I've been saying for quite a while now that political philosophy, as a sort of maybe outsider critic of it, I've been saying it spends a lot of time correctly discussing issues of income inequality, and correctly, that's very important. But it spends, to my mind, an inadequate amount of time discussing issues of power, and particularly issues of power within the workplace, which affect a huge amount of all of our lives. And whenever I say this, I get the same response is, what about Elizabeth Anderson? Which, fair enough, right? So it's great to have you on to sort of fill that. To start with, then, could you outline the basic thesis? It's right there in the subtitle, How Employers Rule Our Lives, or the subheading, rather. What is the essential thesis of this work, or of these lectures?
The key idea is that we have to recognize the workplace as a site of government.
Right.
You have bosses who are ruling over workers, issuing them orders, and threatening to do bad things to them if they don't follow those orders. Maybe they'll get fired or demoted or just yelled at. And when you are subject to orders and have to obey on threat of sanction, you are subject to government. So that way of understanding things allows us to apply the tools of political philosophy to a site where it hasn't usually been applied. As you properly note, most political philosophers are obsessed with the state and ignore authority, government, in other domains outside of the state. And I wanted to highlight the fact that you have millions of workers who are suffering under bosses who are being very abusive and controlling and interfering with their autonomy, even off duty. That's what I wanted to highlight. And it's a problem that's pervasive, especially in the American workplace. So that's government. The workplace is a site of government, but it's also a site of what I call private government. And by that I mean you can ask, if the workplace is a site of government, what is the constitution of that government? Well, it's certainly not a democracy. We know that. There's a handful of worker-owned firms which maybe have a democratic organization, but that's so rare in America. Mostly the constitution of the government of the workplace is a dictatorship in which the bosses have virtually unaccountable power over the workers. The workers don't really have much recourse. to hold their bosses to account. They don't have a voice within the government of the workplace, not a secure voice unless they are represented collectively by a labor union. So that's what I call private government, when the government is kept private from those who are ruled by it and treated as just a private matter of the rulers.
So the first objection would be that most people would think is, well, the workplace is nothing like government because, the state can imprison you or whatever. The state is non-optional. Whereas you can just go find another job. You can leave, if you don't like your boss, you can leave at any point. Would probably be the first reaction people would have to that thesis.
Right. And look, people could emigrate from Italy under Mussolini. We don't say that, therefore, it was a democracy. It's still a dictatorship. Within the EU, there's freedom of movement. People have not only the right to exit any country in the EU, but they actually have an absolute right to enter other countries in the EU. But we don't think that government has ended on account of that. And similarly, for the vast majority of workers, self-employment is not a credible option to make a living. And so really the only options are hopping from one dictatorship to the next. The exit right doesn't change the constitution of the government.
Yeah, and especially in the United States, the cost of leaving can be really quite high because, for instance, our healthcare tends to be tied to our employment. So you can say you're free to leave, but if you have a close relative who is reliant on your healthcare, that's a very precarious sort of freedom. And it's also the case, weirdly, I was thinking about this, that the constraints on leaving a workplace are, employers themselves really make them quite high. So if you leave a job because you were fired or you don't have a good reference leaving that job, it'll be very hard if you're in a competitive field where the different firms know each other. It'll be very hard to find a job at that level of employment again, and you'll have to start at the bottom of the ladder. And that seems to me to be by design. And so in other words, leaving a job can ruin your life, it can kill people, and that doesn't quite get to the power of sanction the state has, firms can't imprison us, but there seems to be an ignorance or a lack of attention to just how severe the sanctions that firms can impose on us really are.
Quite right. So, look, you don't have to say that government only exists when there's a power to imprison or execute you. There are weaker forms of government, but even the weaker forms, such as we find in the workplace, can still impose terrible costs on workers. And that's why they put up with mountains of abuse, because the costs of exit can be extremely high, and also because they have no assurance that if they move to a different firm, things will be any better. To illustrate, about 90% of servers in restaurants are subject to sexual harassment. Well, it's such a notorious and pervasive problem that just moving from one restaurant to the next isn't really going to offer any assurance that one will be able to escape this problem. It's simply out of control and pervasive. So why, exit doesn't really help people that much.
No, not at all. And it's also the case that just the power imbalance is so much that there's a conception that you discuss, I think, in the second lecture, that it's sort of, it's a contract, right? And one of the people you cite refers it to I can go to the grocer and say, I want to buy this brand of tuna, and the employer can say, I want this type of labour from you, as if it's just a choice people make, but accepting people with very specialised skill sets. you take the job or you don't, and the alternative will be another job like it, assuming, you don't have specialised qualifications or higher education or anything like that. You have to take what you're given, and that's it, or you starve and die.
Yes, I think the critical issue here is that the terms of employment are dictated by the employer. And it's only the rare case, either if one is represented by a collective bargaining unit, a union, or if one has rare skills, that one's in a position to do any serious negotiating. The vast majority of employment situations, workers don't even get an opportunity to negotiate terms. So they just have to accept whatever is offered.
Which leads to a huge concentration of power that's absolutely unchallengeable. And that's always been my thing about it, is say what you will about our politicians, and they certainly deserve our abuse and derision at times, we can at least, in theory, vote them out of office. There is nothing at all you can do to challenge the power of a manager. You can file a HR complaint or something, but...
Which is dangerous. 70% of workers who complain about sexual harassment at work face retaliation. No wonder they're keeping silent in the vast majority of such cases. They never even come forth.
Yeah.
So, and on top of that, in the United States, mandatory arbitration agreements are now forced on workers. And that means that they have to take their complaint to an arbitrator who has a contract with the employer, not with the employees. So we already know, we have excellent data on how arbitrators work. They return judgments in favor of the employer vastly more frequently than when workers get to sue their employer in court.
Yeah, and I can't go into details, but I've been a senior manager at some places, and I've been on the sort of bodies that make decisions about, do we let this person go for sexual harassment or fraud or whatever? And even when you're in that place of making a decision, you operate within parameters that are defined by the organisation, shall we say. And again, it's the same thing of, if you don't like that, you can do something else. But even the people really making the calls are doing so within a system that is set up by and set up in the interests of the underlying power structure. Now, that doesn't mean that within that power structure you can't make better and worse decisions and make fairer or unfairer calls, but you're still... you can apply the rules fairly, but the rules are the rules, and you're not in a position to challenge them. So even comparatively senior people, unless you are the person owning the firm, and even then, you're still operating within a legal system that is designed for you,
That's exactly right. So it is important to keep in mind that the default employment contract, the one that exists if there isn't any actual negotiation and haggling over terms, that default contract was actually written by the state. And the state dealt all the authority cards to the employer and none to the worker. There's a baseline of power that's underwritten by labor law that creates this incredible asymmetry. And even the few legal rights that workers have are so dangerous for them to exercise that they frequently just hold their tongue. So it is supposedly a guaranteed right of workers to complain about working conditions, even if they are not represented by a labor union. But it's so dangerous to speak out against a boss who could fire you that most workers don't do that.
You'd kind of be, yes. And certainly this is something that, you don't need a philosophy degree to know. Every worker who's doing like an entry-level job in America knows that making a complaint is putting a target on your back. And indeed, most senior and mid-level people know that acutely because your power in that situation is built on your relationships.
Oh, completely. That's right. And the people in the middle also probably have aspirations to rise up in the organization. And being seen as a troublemaker and a boat rocker or a so-called disgruntled employee is not good for your career prospects.
You will get not the bosses themselves, but people who are your peers, who are close to the bosses, coming up to you and saying things like, "So are you happy here? Have you thought about moving on?" Those sorts of questions
exactly.
will come up.
Yeah. They're helping nudge you out.
There are mechanisms of soft power, you can call it. The other thing, and again, I can't go too much into my own experience with these things, but there's an aspect of the operation of power that we recognise very clearly in political actors, but not at all in, well, I mean, I would say, like, the owners of a big firm are political actors. They wield an incredible amount of power that definitionally is political, but, you know, accepting a sort of state-non-state divide here. Is that we recognise very clearly that power is brutalizing in state actors. So going all the way back to Plato's tyrant, all the way through to the modern day, there's this understanding that having a lot of power isn't good for people. It doesn't do good things to their psychology. And I've seen that, you know, I won't name any organisations, but I've seen that quite up close in senior managers whose essentially the bread and butter of their job is firing people. That it doesn't do good things to them. It didn't do good things to me. And that's sort of one of the reasons you want accountability on power, is not just, I mean, primarily for the sake of the governed, but it's actually being an absolute tyrant of a state or of a private government, as you call them, isn't a position we should want to be in, actually.
Yes, I agree. A part of what's happened, too, with the deregulated, untrammeled capitalism that's emerged since the all-out assault on labor unions and the power of workers, it's not that it corrupts the people at the top. It also makes them ignorant of what's going on because workers are afraid to complain. But on top of that, when workers are disempowered, there's also a selection effect in the top. That is, the narcissists, the megalomaniacs now see an open path to power, whereas before, when executives had to operate under greater constraints and pushback, the type of people who would select into those roles were actually more morally responsive sorts of people. Now we just have total predators up at the top.
And sycophants. And a lot of the time they're not even... So you call it a dictatorship, but with some, like, corporate structures that are, you know, high turnover, not particularly great on employee rights, the analogy that comes to mind most closely for me is sort of like the feudal system in England in the Middle Ages, where you have like these local lords and their fiefdoms, and like some loose centralised authority trying to rein them all in. And
yeah. In fact, sometimes I use the term contract feudalism to describe the workplace.
But the analogy goes not just to the structure, but to the culture of feudalism, where the lord is, like, surrounded by flatterers, and, like, you get these terrible, like, old English aristocrats who were just appalling people, completely ignorant of everything in the world and around them, and would never have gotten near that position if merit was a criteria, but are surrounded by people who just sort of praise them endlessly. And you create these people who then have no awareness of their own limitations, like they can't even take feedback well, and just sort of exist to be flattered. The politics of the sort of court then when you have power that is that unchecked, like that whole culture becomes created. And I'm not saying that's true of there are obviously some very capable, very decent senior managers in America, but it's not about the individuals, it's about the structure creates that culture.
I think there's a lot to be said for that. Certainly in many firms, you see that kind of culture emerging. But I also do want to stress that there's a wide variety of corporate cultures. So it's not uniformly awful. There are actually some really well-managed firms that aren't relentlessly abusive to their workers. And we have to recognize that there is that variety. And that's one of the reasons why we don't see every last worker complaining about their situation or even aware that they're living under a dictatorship when they are. Because for a lot of workers, the work's pretty good.
Yeah, absolutely. And I shouldn't say that some of the things I've been saying apply to every firm or even most. Maybe it's a small minority. But
it also, of course, different workers within the firm experience different kinds of power exercised on them. So generally speaking, the higher up you are, the better things are for you, the less abusive the power. It's really the lower level workers who are easily replaced, the entry level workers, unskilled workers, and so forth, who suffer most of the abuse.
Yeah, I think the kingship aristocratic analogy is quite nice, actually, in that you can have very capable people become, king or whatever, or lord of the manor, and when you get your really, your Frederick the Greats or whatever, it's like, wow, isn't it great that they have all this power, because they can really get stuff done in a way that some sort of more constrained system never could. But then there's also no guardrails on it at all when you get someone who's incompetent or worse, malicious in that role.
Or just single-mindedly focused on profit.
Yes.
So I think an interesting example of this would be Tesla making the electric car. The consumer reviews indicate that at least their high-end model is a spectacular car and unbelievably fun to drive. So as a piece of technology, it's quite impressive. But Elon Musk himself is a little bit of a megalomaniac and a narcissist. And he's just completely out of control. One of the consequences of this is that there's no safety in his assembly plan. Because it's speed at all costs. He realizes that the company needs to expand its market, and, to hell with worker safety. There's tons of accidents. People are injured, and he just doesn't care.
Yeah, and Tesla has recently outed himself as something of a complete idiot on Twitter as soon as he got onto social media and we just got the live.
Oh yeah, really, they should shut down his Twitter account for sure.
I think all of these people should be on Twitter. I want the live feed from that guy's brain. And it's just...
See how pathological they are?
Yeah, well, what do Marxists say? It's very demystifying of this ideological idea that the captains of industry are there because they're the hardest, steeliest, most competent, you know what I mean, people in our society. And when you get just their brain farts going live to all of us, it really... It's demystification, right? The Marxist concept, where you just suddenly see, oh, no, they're just as stupid as the rest of us,
Yeah, well, Musk has a big ego, but then you also just have some executives who are kind of spreadsheet managers.
Yeah.
They have no connection, actually, to the conditions on the ground. They're just trying to push numbers in various directions. And these people, I don't even think it's ego for them. It's just they've got numbers they want to hit, and they don't care how this happens. And then things go wrong. So look at Boeing, for instance. The Boeing managers, they're pretty much faceless. Do we even know who the Boeing executives are? They don't have a profile the way Elon Musk has.
I couldn't name them if my life depended on it.
They don't seem to be publicity hogs. But they were just so driven by this need to deliver these supermax jets, and safety goes out the window. Now safety for passengers. We're not even talking about the workers here. They just they had deadlines, they had production schedules, they just had to get things done so they could book their profits. It's all about moving the numbers on which their bonuses are based. And in fact, they were remarkably shockingly detached from the engineers, from the actual assembly plants. They didn't care. They just said, deliver the goods. Whether they were defective products, it didn't matter.
Yeah. There's a final element to this, and I wanted to ask your opinion on this. So I've just done a long series on Machiavelli, of all people, who I read as having a sort of republican non-domination conception of freedom. And one thing I found interesting in his work was there was a continual going back to ideas of domination and linking it to ideas of humiliation. The feelings of powerlessness are very closely connected to feelings of humiliation. And even though our dominant ideology of, call it what you will, libertarianism, neoliberalism, what have you, has sort of sanitized these power structures and said that we don't need to ask questions about the operation of power within them in the way that we would with states. That doesn't change the lived experience of the people at the bottom of those power structures, or even often in the middle of those power structures, in that as a matter of lived experience, they feel that powerlessness very closely. And more than that, they feel humiliated. And in my formulation, humiliation isn't just that you're subject to domination, it's that the dominator is rubbing your nose in it. He's making it plain to you, you are, or she for that matter, that you are powerless. And I think that there's, for many, many people who are by definition people who are not very powerful, who don't have a big voice in our society, a huge amount of their mental energy is subsumed in feelings of humiliation that can then lead to feelings of anger. And that anger doesn't have anywhere to go because it can't express itself within those power structures. And it ends up erupting in the political realm in ways that can be productive insofar as elevating left-wing outsiders like Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn, but it also can be incredibly destructive in terms of these explosions of bigotry and nativism and xenophobia that we've seen throughout the Western world. And people are always saying, why are voters so angry? And it's like, because voters feel powerless and humiliated. And it's not often that much to do with the government. It's just they're the ones that's the power structure that they have the ability to give a kicking to. But if you look at just the lived experience of their day life, they just have to eat shit every day and do it with a grin on their face. Like you say, the waitress going to work. I'm amazed that statistic isn't 100% or 99%, And they have to deal with that, and then they have to get told off by their boss. I know a lot of people who spent a lot of time in the serving industry. You will be blamed for being sexually harassed. What did you do to provoke it? And people have an innate sense of dignity and pride, and that has to go somewhere, and it becomes anger. And anyway, so I'll pause there. But do you think that's a plausible narrative for why a lot of the anger and the lack of trust in our systems is emerging?
Well, I do think that the fact that neoliberalism took over even the center-left political parties certainly has made people think, well, nobody cares about us.
Right.
So, the Democratic Party basically went over to neoliberalism under Clinton, and that was a political strategy. It led to these free trade agreements which actually had a pretty devastating effect on manufacturing in the United States. If you look at the counties that shifted in the 2016 election, from having voted for Obama in 2012 to flipping to Trump in 2016, a lot of them are these rural, exurban, former manufacturing centers where people lost jobs, mostly due to China's accession to the World Trade Organization and then the overpowering competitiveness of low-wage Chinese manufacturing led to the shutdown of all these plants. But then, of course, what's frustrating people is that they're unemployed, not even so much as that they're getting abused and humiliated at work, although I suppose one of the consequences of unemployment is then they take much more horrible jobs that pay less. Maybe they get stuck working at Walmart now, and Walmart is a notoriously abusive employer, where they have a relentless pace and the poor workers are getting yelled at all the time. So that's certainly an experience of humiliation. There's a felt sense of loss where they once had a dignified job, perhaps even protected by a labor union, and now they're in a crack job. I think, that could be part of it. There's a rage against the system because really even the left parties abandon them. And then, where do you have an outlet for that rage? Well, we see in both countries demagogic attempts to direct that anger against immigrants, which is, I think, just it's a distraction from what's really going on, which is plutocracy.
Do you think, though, that... I'll just ask this question. There's the sort of question that gets asked of the whole Trump movement of, is this racism or economic anxiety or both? My answer would be it's both, but we shouldn't discount the racism element, right?
Oh, the racism element is incredibly prominent, and this is actually a very old playbook that was created, political playbook, that was created in the United States in the 19th century in struggles over the abolition of slavery. So you had John C. Calhoun, famous pro-slavery senator, very powerful politician in the United States government for a very long time, defending slavery against the anti-slavery agitation up north. And basically, Abraham Lincoln's anti-slavery argument was not just that slavery was wrong, it was an injustice to the slaves, but also that it undermined the interests of free white workers. His argument was, for one thing, if slaves do manual labor, then anyone doing manual labor gets demeaned and stigmatized because they're doing slave work. But also there was a material interest that free workers had in ensuring that everyone is a free worker, so they don't have to compete against slave labor. This is a particular concern out west where there were still territories open for settlement. Lincoln argued that if you let slave owners go out to these territories, they'll create these giant plantations with hundreds of slaves and displace opportunities for free workers to stake out a homestead of their own and be self-employed. Calhoun had an argument against that, and he wrote a very famous speech. He delivered a very famous speech, and he said, these Northerners, they don't understand how things work in the South. Among us whites, whether we own slaves or not, whether we're rich or poor, we all enjoy a status of equality in virtue of being white. And we're all superior to blacks, whether they're slave or free. And basically what Calhoun was saying here is to whites, to poor whites who are economically exploited and trampled down by the economic system, he's saying we're offering you a better bargain than those Northerners. Yeah, sure, you're going to be poor and downtrodden, but you still get to trample all over blacks. You have racial privilege. You get all these symbolic goods that we're offering you in virtue of being white, and that's the kind of consolation prize for the fact that you are propertyless and desperate. And it's an incredibly persuasive argument, and we still have whites today who are voting against their material interests because they have a deeper stake in whiteness and white privilege. Their symbolic stake, and that's what they took that bargain, and they continue to take it. And meanwhile, their pockets are getting picked by the plutocrats. But they're okay with that.
But it's very real. Like, I think the fact that these feelings are, morally grotesque shouldn't blind us to this is a motivating ideology for tens of millions of Americans. And they experience the loss of that ability to have someone under them, to be able to freely discriminate against black people. So they experience that loss as humiliating.
I think that's right. But there's also a fear element that's extremely important. If anything, I think fear is more dominant than statism in today's politics. This idea that people of color are going to be demographically superior and that whites are going to be shut out of power, it's just terrifying.
I think people are
white Trump voters.
I think people are genuinely concerned by that. I guess it's just a feeling I don't relate to very well. Like, it's just not happening. Like, even if, non-white people become 52% of America, like, we still have a lock on all of the power structures in the country. Like, we still own all of the wealth. Like, you're not, the horde is not coming for your stuff anytime soon. This is a fantasy, and it's a perverse fantasy.
Well, of course it is a perverse fantasy, but passed down for endless generations. So if you go back to Thomas Jefferson's Notes on Virginia. So Jefferson's this Enlightenment guy. He perfectly knows that slavery is wrong. He even wrote about it, how slavery is not only immoral and unjust and a violation of human rights, but also that it's profoundly corrupting of slave owners.
Yes.
He's one of the most insightful writers on that. So in Notes on Virginia, he considers, well, given the gross injustice of slavery, shouldn't we just, free all the slaves? And he asked this question, and he entertains a number of reasons why one might not, but the one that really gets to him is the worry that if the slaves were freed, they would rise up in vengeance and try to kill all the whites, and a race war would erupt. That terror of black freedom has been passed down from generation to generation, never mind that it's completely irrational and wildly conspiratorial. We also know that in fact, Trump voters are, if you look in the polling data, the people who voted for Trump in the primaries before he actually won the Republican Party nomination, those people are off the charts more conspiracy-minded than any other group in America. Right? And so if you're already a little paranoid and worried and anxious and fearful, that somebody's going to come to get you, right? And that's sort of the disposition that Trump has been actively promoting. Although less so these days about African Americans than about immigrants.
Yeah.
But there's this panic. It's a racial panic about people coming across the Mexican border.
Yeah. This is getting way off topic, but one of my favourite studies ever showed that the sort of specific subset of people who are most susceptible to conspiracy theories are people who are lower intelligence but have the highest estimation of their own intelligence.
Yeah, right.
And it's not nice to say it, but they've done social science on this, and it's low IQ, low educated people who nonetheless have a very strong egoic sense. And yeah. I mean, if the glove fits, Thank you for listening to the Political Philosophy Podcast. Coming up next, as I mentioned at the beginning, will be the second part of my conversation with Professor Anderson. We're going to go more into detail on Trump and racism. We're going to discuss a potential theory for why professional political philosophers focus more on inequalities of wealth than they do on inequalities of power. And I'm going to pursue one of my pet theses, that Trump is a very good representation of Plato's tyrant. So, all of that's to come. I hope you'll join us next week for it. As always, if you want to support this podcast, please do so. There's a few ways you can do that. Sharing episodes always really helps. We've grown our audience now, thousands of people tune into this. So that's all just really from people sharing on their social media. So if you can hit that share button when you finish the episode, that is much, 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 much appreciated. And if you're able to support in a more monetary way, check out our Patreon page. Once again, that's just patreon.com/political philosophy podcast. And the links are on our website, which is politicalphilosophypodcast.com. So if you are able to support for $1 or $2 even, that would be greatly, greatly appreciated. This show does not have any advertisers. I think advertisements spoil the quality of podcasts. I hate it when, I'm listening to a show and we suddenly take a break to learn about that just new toothpaste or new underwear or something. It bugs me. So because it's my podcast, I don't want to do it. So I don't. But there are various costs associated with doing this, and I'm very, very fortunate to have listeners who chip in to help me cover those costs. So very, very grateful for them. And if everyone's able to chip in, then we should be able to continue funding this podcast. And I say everyone, even if just a small percentage of people chip in. So that's my appeal for support. And yeah, apart from that, thanks again for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next week for part 2.